finally, it's policymakers begin to advance a future vision for policies that align to the principles of transparency, equity, rigor, but also has the right structural incentives so that all kids can truly succeed. No Child Left Behind, the Every Student Succeeds Act, both were about students achieving mastery. They were big steps forward. The question now is how they might evolve to enable multiple pathways to the same ultimate objective. We know there are some who disagree with our assertion. They will argue that testing kids at grade level is what's required to make expectations clear and results comparable and transparent. All of that is true. But at the same time, we would ask, what is the purpose of an accountability system if it's not going to enable students to accelerate? And that if, in that, students are falling further behind each year, shouldn't policymakers try to create the space for new solutions to emerge? To not be so focused on next year's state test that we lose sight of the bigger picture of why we're all here to begin with. We understand these are hard conversations to have. No one wants to be against high expectations for kids. Not teachers, not schools, not organizations like ours. We all need to guard against that. At the same time, if the net result of not having these conversations is to simply to tell teachers what the system told me 20 years ago, just figure it out, to somehow meet the needs of Robert and the Allens, and everyone in between, while also covering all grade of material. At the same time, if the net result of not having these conversations is simply to tell all teachers what the system told me, to just figure it out, to somehow meet the needs of Robert and Alan and everyone in between. To enable all students, regardless from wherever they're starting from, to access the education they truly deserve. Thank you.
Good.
Keeping the lights on.
So does that mean I'm here?
Okay, all right.
I'm after you.
Good morning.
Good. Well, we'll see.
Hi, everyone. Please take your seats. So welcome to Georgetown Law. Welcome to the Hart Auditorium. My name is Paul Ohm. I am the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs here at the Law Center. I heartily wanted to welcome you to the Law Center this morning to hear about a really important topic. I extend the regrets of Dean Bill Traynor, who is traveling right now and couldn't be here today. This is a presentation of FutureED, which is situated in the McCourt School of Public Policy, and we welcome Tom Talk to the panel that will happen. But the star of the show and the main event is a new report from New Classrooms called The Iceberg Problem. I am an educator, I'm a professor, and I'm also in charge of the curriculum here at the law school, so it's with great interest that I began to look through some of the results and look forward to kind of a lively and vibrant conversation. I'm also the parent of 9th grade twins, and so in my opinion, there can be no higher calling and qualification for sainthood than to think about math at the middle school level, especially if it's being led by someone who used to teach math at the middle school level. And so to start the events, I'm happy to pass the microphone over to the CEO of New Classrooms, Joel Rose. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's start the day off with a math problem, shall we? It's a two-step algebraic equation, the kind that just about every middle school math student in the US needs to tackle at some point. 3x plus 5 equals 26. Now maybe this is something that you learned back in the 6th grade or the 7th grade. It doesn't really matter. But can you imagine trying to learn this if you didn't quite know how to multiply or divide or basic algebraic thinking, like what's an x? I'm a former 5th grade math teacher. Like most teachers, I worked hard, I cared a lot. I tried to make my class as rigorous and engaging as I possibly could. But I had Robert, who came into my class on a 2nd grade level, and I had Ellen, who came into my class on an 8th grade level. And I had everything in between. And somehow, I had to reconcile the conflict between trying to meet each of their unique needs, while also covering all of the 5th grade material that was going to appear on the end-of-year state test. It was a massive challenge for me trying to do it all. But it's actually even a bigger challenge for today's teachers because the standards themselves are higher. And what that really means for a middle grade math teacher, before the school year ever even begins, the gap between where students are and where they're supposed to be is even wider than it once was. What's also different today is that there are teachers, schools, organizations like ours who are trying to do something a bit different, who are trying to use modern tools and approaches to actually solve this problem by connecting where students actually are to where they need to be. And what's emerging, at least in our work, is something we didn't quite expect when my partner Chris Rush and I began this work about a decade ago. It's a realization that in math, some educational policies designed more than 30 years ago to improve the number of students graduating ready for college or a post-secondary career, those policies may in fact be preventing them from getting there at all. That's why we wrote The Iceberg Problem, to bring this all to light. Now we know there's genuine complexity and nuance in this debate. Expectations matter, and students from historically disadvantaged groups are at particular risk of attending schools that simply don't expect enough. These policies were designed to provide real, comparable data into achievement gaps so that we can ultimately move to a more equitable society. Knowing where kids are relative to high standards, providing that information to parents, to educators, and to the public, and then holding educators accountable to outcomes. These are essential building blocks for moving to address our system's inherent inequities. We cannot let them go away. At the same time, we have come to understand in our work with hundreds of teachers and thousands of students all across the country that sometimes policies can have unintended consequences. And the iceberg problem is one of those. The iceberg problem is about 3 interrelated points. The first is that math is cumulative. A student's going to have a hard time learning how to calculate the area of a circle if they don't know much about exponents. They're going to struggle with percents if they don't quite get decimals. This is just the nature of math itself. Second, millions of students are coming into middle school with unfinished learning back from elementary school. Only 40% of 4th graders are proficient in math based on the most recent administration of the NAEP. And because math is cumulative, that means many of them are going to have learning gaps that are going to keep them from succeeding with more advanced concepts in the 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, and beyond. And the third is that federal and state policies signal to teachers that when choosing between meeting students' unique needs and covering grade level material, opt for the grade level material. Teachers and principals care about doing well on the end of year test. And that test is almost exclusively focused on grade level standards. So they're going to teach what will be tested. When you put all of this together, the nature of math being cumulative, students having unfinished learning back from elementary school, and policy signaling to teachers to teach grade level standards, students can fall further behind. Because here's what really happens. When a 6th grade student comes into the 6th grade with unfinished learning back from elementary school, they're likely to learn a set of skills. And some of them they're going to get, and some of them they're not going to get. The school will look at their 6th grade test scores, but chances are it won't keep the student from moving on to the 7th grade. Once they get to the 7th grade teacher is now supposed to focus on the 7th grade standards. So many of those skills that the student didn't learn in 6th grade will stay unlearned. Unfortunately, once the school year ends, many of those 7th grade skills will also go unlearned. The principal, the district, the public, they'll all look at the 7th grade test scores while all of that unfinished learning continues to accumulate. And by the 8th grade, the problem grows even worse. We call this the iceberg problem. It suggests while the collective attention of educators is focused on how students are performing on grade level assessments, the unfinished learning from prior years is actually accumulating below the surface, hidden from view, making it harder for students to ultimately graduate with the skills they need to succeed. To say it a bit differently, schools ask the 5th grade teacher to teach 5th grade standards, fill in the gaps as best they can, and then we see what sticks. Then they ask the 6th grade teacher to teach the 6th grade standards, fill in the gaps as best they can, and then see what sticks. And do it again in the 7th, and do it again in the 8th. As one former superintendent once shared with me, it's a strategy that's called spray and pray. But it is how schools generally work today. It's an approach that seems to work okay for about 1/3 of students who graduate each year ready for college or a post-secondary career. They're often the ones where the standard instructional path seems to work just fine. They can learn 5th grade material in 5th grade and 6th grade material in 6th grade. They don't really fall behind all that much. But for everyone else, if they come off of that standard path, for whatever reason, there aren't many paths for them to get back on. Schools just can't keep doing this and miraculously expect results to turn around. Look, once a child gets past basic numeracy, there are roughly 300 mathematical skills and concepts that kids need to understand deeply and conceptually and to apply flexibly. That is not an insurmountable number by any stretch if each student actually gets the skills that they need given where they are and where they need to be. In my class, the right set of skills for Robert, given where he was starting from, were different than the right set of skills for Ellen, given where she was starting from. But insisting that all students should get the same set of skills, whether they're 3 years behind, 3 years ahead, or anything in between, actually keeps both the Roberts and the Ellens from accelerating as far as they could. Yes, expectations matter. We cannot let the Roberts of the world stay in remediation forever, to never get to where they need to be. That would be just unacceptable. But in our quest to put the Roberts on a path to college readiness, schools can't simply ignore basic mathematical dependencies, because if they do, students will fall further behind. Math, and especially middle grade math, is different than how other subject areas actually work. And there's actually evidence of this in the NAEP itself. Whenever the NAEP scores come out, policymakers and journalists focus on whether the 4th grade scores have gone up or go down. And over the last decade, at least in math, they've been relatively flat. But what gets less attention is actually what happens between the 4th grade and the 8th grade. Here in DC public schools, for example, 30% of 4th graders back in 2013 were proficient in math based on NAEP. Certainly a problem in and of itself. But by the time that cohort of students finished 8th grade 4 years later, 20% were proficient. The same pattern holds true in New York City. 34% of 4th graders were proficient back in 2013. That dropped to 28% by the time that cohort of students left the 8th grade. This same pattern of math proficiency levels dropping between 4th and 8th grade holds true in Atlanta. It holds true in Dallas. It holds true in Miami-Dade. In fact, of the 21 school districts that participated in TUDA, only one saw their 8th grade proficiency levels higher than their 4th grade proficiency levels. It was Detroit that went from 4% proficient to 5% proficient. So is this just a problem in the cities? Actually, in every single state, proficiency levels drop in math between the 4th grade and the 8th grade. And this is not the case in reading. Between the 4th and 8th grades, reading proficiency levels actually go up or stay flat in almost 2/3 of all states. Nationally, 4th graders saw their proficiency rates in math drop 8 points, while reading actually went up. Math is different. In our own work, we also see evidence that the iceberg problem is making it harder for students to accelerate. Over the last several years, schools have asked that we configure Teach to One in different ways. Some have asked us to focus on student growth. There are ones in cities such as Chicago, which are less focused on changes on year-over-year state tests. Others ask that we configure the program in ways that provides more exposure to grade-level content. So which one works better? Well, we now have a better answer to that question. Researchers found that on the NWA MAP assessment, schools and districts that emphasize learning growth grew 38 percentile points over 3 school years, while those that were more focused on grade level proficiency grew 7 percentile points. Now we know this isn't all about assessment and accountability. Teachers matter, leadership matters, school climate matters. And let's face it, we've been teaching 7th grade students 7th grade material long before the current assessment and accountability system took root. it's going to take a lot more than just shifts in these policies if we're ever going to have schools that are more attuned to each student's unique strengths and needs. But policies shouldn't be blocking this either. Teachers, schools, and organizations like ours will simply not be able to create innovative solutions unless policymakers create the space for those new approaches to emerge. The fact of the matter is that while schools and districts want to innovate, that comes second to showing gains on next year's state test. We've worked in too many communities where administrators and teachers will say, sometimes in tears, something like, I know what you all are trying to do is much better for our kids in the longer term, but if we don't show higher test scores next year, I could lose my job. So please just play the game that they want us to play. That game is the wrong game for kids. What matters is long-term mastery, ensuring all students are able to achieve the ultimate objective of college and career readiness, even though some may take different paths to get there, and will get there at different times. So what can be done? Well, we know there isn't much appetite today in Washington, D.C. to rethink the law itself. And that means that states and districts are going to have to be the ones to push the boundaries of the law as far as they can. And we've listed a number of recommendations in the report. First, measure true learning growth by using adaptive assessments in addition to state tests. If the goal is ultimately to move all students to college and career readiness, educators need to know where they're starting from. And adaptive tests just do this much better than grade level tests because they include skills from prior and subsequent years. Cities such as Chicago and Tulsa have actually created their own local accountability systems based on these tests as opposed to their state assessments. Second, modify state accountability systems so that schools can look at growth over multiple years or emphasize key grade levels. There just are many students who are beginning each school year multiple years behind. They need a different pathway, one that may take more than a single year to fully catch back up to proficiency. Schools need the space from policymakers to make that happen. Next, launch math innovation zones. This is an approach that the state of Texas has created. They picked a set of districts and schools that want to be innovative, helped them to identify a set of partners, and provided them with a different accountability system based on growth in service of longer-term mastery. And finally, it's important for policymakers to begin to advance a future vision for education that's aligned with the principles of transparency, rigor, and equity, but also has the right instructional incentives so that all kids can truly succeed. No Child Left Behind, the Every Student Succeeds Act, both were about all students achieving mastery. They were big steps forward. The question now is how they might evolve to enable multiple pathways to that same ultimate objective. We know there are some who will disagree with our assertion. They will argue that testing kids at grade level is what's required to make expectations clear and results comparable and transparent. And all of that is true. But at the same time, we would ask, what is the purpose of an accountability system if not to enable students to accelerate? And then if in math, students are falling further behind each year, shouldn't policymakers try to create the space for new solutions to emerge? To not be so focused on next year's state test that we lose sight of why we're all here to begin with. We understand these are hard conversations to have. No one wants to be against high expectations for kids, not schools, not teachers, not organizations like ours, no one. At the same time, if the net result of not having these conversations is we simply tell teachers what the system told me, to just figure it out, to somehow meet the needs of the Ellens and the Roberts and everyone in between, while also covering all of the grade level material. We know what will end up happening. Teachers like me become teachers in order to give kids like Robert and Ellen the tools they need to realize their own unique potential, to set them up for their long-term success. Overall, that's not happening enough today, certainly not in math. Kids are coming in behind, and because math is cumulative, teaching only the grade level material may actually be causing them to fall behind even more. We hope the iceberg problem can help to spur a new kind of conversation, one that's focused on how we collectively build the systems and supports that are truly required to enable all students from wherever they may be starting from to access the kind of education they deserve. Thank you.
We're going to bring the panel up. Nice job, Joel. Why don't you sit second to the last and let Roberto sit at the end because he's got to leave. In case you didn't realize, we're in alphabetical order.
Not quite.
Welcome. My name is Tom Tock. I'm director of FutureED, and as Paul said a few minutes ago, it's a pleasure for the Law Center and FutureED to host this morning's important conversation. We're fortunate to have a distinguished panel to help us explore the issues that Joel raised in his presentation and in the report. To my immediate right is Kirsten Baszler, North Carolina's State Superintendent.
North Dakota.
Did I say North Carolina? I'm in the wrong time zone. Sorry.
okay.
North Dakota's State Superintendent of Schools. Jim Blue, as many of you know, is Assistant U.S. Secretary of Education for Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development. Shavar Jeffries, who's in the wrong seat, sorry, Shavar, is president of
Want to switch now since we're in the
Yeah,
race? Okay.
no, it is fine.
I know, just something.
He's president of Democrats for Education Reform. He's a former assistant New Jersey Attorney General for Civil Rights, and he is a New Classrooms board member. Karen Nussel, to Shavar's left, is president of Conservative Leaders for Education and a former education policy advisor to then Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. Joel, we know, and Roberto, all the way to the right, Roberto Rodriguez is president of Teach Plus, and he's a former deputy assistant to the president for education in the Obama administration. So let's start with Joel's core argument that the federal Every Student Succeeds Act can hurt students struggling in math by requiring that states test students' grasp of grade level materials, a mandate that the report says, and Joel argues, discourages schools from addressing the unfinished learning students have from prior years, creating the iceberg effect. Karen, start with you.
Well, first of all, Joel, congratulations. It's a great report. I think it gives us all a lot to think about. I think what you found resonates with a lot of us from our personal experience, from anecdotes from being in schools. But I'm not necessarily ready to ditch grade level testing until I know what's coming after it. And so I find myself, I feel like this is a weak statement, but I find myself not quibbling with the what, but the how. Because we've just come through a really dramatic last 5 years in the testing environment. A lot of states have done a lot of work, and there's been a lot of bloodshed over the tests we currently have, which aren't perfect in most places. But we have to start somewhere, and trying to figure out if kids are proficient at grade level is where we've compromised right? That's what all policy is eventually, is a compromise, and we've compromised to be at that point. So while I don't, and I mean, the results of the study are stunning, right? We're clearly failing these kids. So we really should be having this conversation about what to do different, but I'm struggling with how we get there.
Thanks. What's your take, and what is the story in North Dakota, and how does it relate to Joel's argument?
So I'm thrilled that we are having this conversation. This is my 29th year in education in some way, shape, or form, and we have needed to have this conversation for a long time. So I appreciate the momentum. I appreciate the paper that is elevating this conversation to a national level. I agree that I do not want to move away from grade level assessments, but I believe that we've placed far too much emphasis on it. It shouldn't be this or that. It needs to be an and. And so the reason that I'm so committed to this conversation is in North Dakota, you've read from my bio that I was a teacher's assistant, a classroom teacher, vice principal in a building, was the president of a school board of one of our larger school systems in the state of North Dakota for nearly a decade. And when I came into this role as the elected state superintendent, I'd had a lot of colleagues, and at every level we were talking about we need to do things differently, we need to do things differently. In North Dakota, there really isn't an opportunity for charter schools. We have 178 school districts, and some of them, I have a school district that has 8 students in them, and the nearest school is 40 minutes away. So there isn't a lot of opportunity or desire for a charter to come in and to do things differently. So we need to adjust our public school system to allow them to have the same opportunity of innovation and really personalize their learning. In 2017, bipartisan effort where the state education agency, our Greater North Dakota Chamber, our teachers union traveled across the state to say we need to do things differently. We need to personalize our learning. We need to measure what we're doing with our students differently. And so we were able to pass a piece of legislation in our state that allowed me to provide waivers to any school district in the state from state laws, state requirements, as long as that district had a plan. 5 of our school districts are currently on a journey with KnowledgeWorks to personalize our learning, and they're doing as much as they can to be innovative, be personalized, but consistently over and over. This first year, we're launching year 2 of this tomorrow back in North Dakota. They said, the accountability system that we are operating under at a federal level, it's about that state test. We can only go so far in doing what we need to do for our students with this in place. What can we do to get some reprieve from that while we are testing out what we're doing for students differently? On top of that, the second prong that is significantly important to me is the fact that 11% of my student population are Native American students. And that brings with it a whole complexity of different issues. But what we have been doing consistently under No Child Left Behind, grateful that it called out the fact that our Native American students were not performing at the level that they needed to perform at. Grateful for No Child Left Behind to do that. But 15 years of that, and now 3 years of ESSA, we are still identifying the same schools with the same needs, and we need to do things differently for them in the grade level. Not being able to celebrate their growth, that they're bringing these students from this grade level to that grade level, but they're still not at proficiency, is piling on the learned hopelessness that they already have in their communities.
Thanks. Roberto, what's your take on Joel's argument? You were intimately involved in the development of the grade level expectations, both under NCLB and then ESSA.
Sure, and congratulations, Joel, on the report. I think the iceberg problem is a really important contribution to the conversation that we need to have today in the national debate about how we evolve standards-based reform in our assessment and accountability policies moving forward. I think the great lesson of this report is that the progress and the growth of individual students matters, right? And so that's, if we move from that premise and we look at and unpack some of the report's findings, the one that stands out for me that I think is a real call for us to think about how we support states and teachers in moving forward is this finding that the current assessment regime in too many states doesn't allow teachers to differentiate their instruction, to move above grade level and below grade level to be able to respond to the individual needs of our students. So regardless of whether that was the intention or not of No Child Left Behind, of ESSA, of standards-based reform, if that is dynamic, that is real in classrooms and in schools, we need to take some action to respond to that and figure out how we meet that charge. You know, when we framed No Child Left Behind in 2001, this work around focusing on grade level assessments and grade level standards was critically important. We had throughout the 90s, states leading the charge around standards-based reform, doing more to focus on the importance of high standards for all kids. We had only 15 states that were actually annually measuring the progress of students, disaggregated by race, by income, by English learner proficiency, by disability, when President Bush called for annual assessments, grades 3 through 8. It galvanized bipartisan support. We had a very active debate in the Senate and in the House around that, but ultimately people came together around that vision because it was about accountability for kids. That imperative, I think, still stands. It's why it was reflected in ESSA. And the work to get all kids to grade level proficiency and college and career readiness by the end of their time in high school is still the civil rights work of our time. We can't afford to abandon that work. At the same time, over 17 years, the state of assessment has evolved, right? We have adaptive abilities to measure the skills and progress of our kids the way we didn't used to have. And if we can bring some of those tools into the toolbox alongside a focus on success for every child and college and career readiness for every child, I think that's a formula that will help move us forward. So I'm excited about the contribution that the report makes to the debate. I think we need to be focused with our state policymakers and with our teachers and our principals and our superintendents to figure out how do we make sense of that and move our accountability system forward.
Thanks. Sure. Grade level testing requirements are designed to ensure, as Roberto has just argued, to ensure that schools have the same expectations for every student. It's designed to protect traditionally underserved student populations, right? You're a very strong supporter of these sorts of civil rights protections, right? But you're also a new classrooms board member. So do you support the organization's recommendation to abandon grade level testing? How do you thread that needle?
I'm reminded of something the great philosopher Jay-Z said. He said, I'm Che Guevara with bling on, I'm complex. Some of y'all may not get that. But, well, so for me, I think first, I think it's very important, and I don't think, first, congrats to Joel and Chris and New Classrooms. I think the work they do is really transformational. And I think, like many have said, this is a space where we can integrate many things because public education, like many things, are complex. You've got to integrate many things that oftentimes can seem contradictory but aren't. I think it's very important, and I don't think the paper disagrees with this. I think it's very important to remind ourselves what the accountability frameworks have done, right? Because for many, many generations, particularly when you combine it with the fact that in many school districts throughout the country, particularly serving historically disadvantaged subgroups, whether it's low-income students, whether it's students who speak English as a second language, students of color, students with disabilities, there's an orientation in many school systems that these children really can't learn the same as others, right? Sometimes it's explicit, often, generally it's more insidious, it's more subtle, right? It was quick to have excuses about, well, these kids of color, their parents don't care, or they're poor, or whatever the case may be, or these immigrant kids, they can't learn the same as others, these poor kids, that may be the case. And frankly, we needed the accountability framework to say that's not acceptable, that we expect all schools to serve all children at a high level, and we're going to hold you accountable for that, and we're going to connect that to dollars, because oftentimes that's the only language that certain people understand. And we have seen significant gains. I mean, we're here to talk about some of the challenges, and I'm going to do that in a second, but I think it's important to situate it and say that we've seen graduation rates go up, for example, for kids of color. I would argue in part because of some of the accountability regime that we've seen. And so as a civil rights attorney who's fought for low-income families for 20 years now, for kids of color for 20 years. I was a school board president in Newark. I founded Public Charter School Network in the city of Newark. To me, that's non-negotiable. I would never support anything that would roll back a framework that at its foundational level is essential to making sure that these schools actually do what it is that they're supposed to do for young people. So I start with that. So that said, I think at the same time, and also want to make the point too, that we obviously got to make sure our accountability framework operates in such a way that our kids are actually on grade level for 5th grade math, right? Because obviously the premise here is what do you do when by 5th grade in math the kids haven't learned the precedent skills so that they can learn what they need to learn in middle school math. And, and obviously we need to have some different remedies there. But obviously we got to figure out a way, how do we organize our schools in a way where babies on grade level at the end of 4th grade, right? I'm a parent of 2 kids. I'm not going to accept the premise that, well, we're going to assume your kids aren't going to be great at 5th grade, then now what do we do? The reality is, though, we know many kids are in that space. And we also know, and I think the iceberg problem piece really speaks to this powerfully, we also know that the general accountability framework doesn't really align with what needs to happen with that subgroup of young people. And so there, I think it makes perfect sense to have alternative approaches in that context. And I think it's very important for it to be targeted so that rather than kind of blanket waivers of accountability, we have pilot programs, targeted programs that are focused on those schools where there's a disproportionate challenge in this space in terms of the extent to which kids are behind in middle school math. I think it's very important that we have evidence-based programs. I think new classrooms is one. So it's not we're just going to wave and do whatever, but that there's to be some evidence, there's to be a predicate that what you're going to do, actually that there's evidence that shows that'll get the children to grade level proficiency at an appropriate time. And that leads me to the third piece, which is grade level proficiency has to be the ultimate goal. So that maybe so rather than the year-over-year proficiency that the accountability frameworks generally expect, in exchange for using an evidence-based program to deal with the challenge that at middle school math, if you don't have the precedent skills, we may need some different intervention. In exchange for that flexibility, you got to get the babies where they need to be. I would argue no later than 8th grade. I personally like to see it even before that. So if we're going to trigger this at 5th grade, is it 2 years? Is it 3? It seems to me quite clearly no later than the point at which those children are going to high school. They got to hit the mark in terms of grade level proficiency. So if we have those kind of guardrails, then I'm personally would be comfortable with a targeted evidence-based intervention to deal with the iceberg problem.
All right, great, thanks. Jim, what does the federal law and regulation sort of require regarding grade level assessments, and what's the department's thinking on this issue?
Well, so let me first preface with a couple of shout outs. First of all, I've got to compliment New Classrooms. You, Chris, the work that you've done over the last several years. And I really want to compliment moving from an organization that is focused on teaching and learning into the policy sphere. It's ugly, and thank you very much for having the courage to do this, because I think you've added to the policy debate here in a very constructive way. In fact, the last time I can think of an organization that was focused on teaching and learning jumping into the policy arena was when TNTP issued the widget effect report, where suddenly people who actually knew what was going on in terms of teaching and learning said, wait a second, there's something just wrong here. And that resonated with the whole ed reform movement. I think you're seeing that today. Second shout out for just having this panel. It is less and less frequent in Washington where you get all of the voices of education reform at one place. And that also takes some courage, because people in this town shun the Trump administration, Betsy DeVos, because they're afraid that they're going to get up on stage and talk about this radical notion that families should be able to choose the situation for their children that best fits their needs. See how I did that? We should be at the table. Karen and I should be at more tables voicing a more conservative perspective on how these things should evolve. All that said, then I want to give a shout out for the report. Look, this report is a really bad news for the education reform movement. It's really bad news for Congress. And here's why. We find with this evidence that our assumptions about grade level testing are actually exacerbating the problems, that we're actually making it worse for the low-income families that most of us got into this movement to support. That is not an indictment of NCLB or ESSA. I think there's a natural evolution. Shavar, as you pointed out, like we needed NCLB to shine a spotlight on what most of us knew were the inequities in this country. But I think this report tells us that we should not double down on grade level testing. We need, and this is where I'll have to respect Karen's point of view, we need to decide if our goal is to keep kids on grade level or to get kids college and career ready. And I think if we focus on the latter goal, we're not as worried about those incremental steps. You're worried about the end goal, and if we can't keep the factory keeping every kid in each grade level to get there, that we have to come up with a system that meets every kid where they are, make sure that they end up at the end of school at college and ready, and if at points they're not on line with what people think grade level is, so be it. It's worse what's happening now than the kind of world that you guys have laid out. So thank you.
So let's come at the report's central point from a slightly different direction. So the question that sort of came to my mind in reading the report is, has grade level testing requirements led to, as you say in the report, an exclusive focus on grade level instruction regardless of individual students' needs? Or do teachers and principals find ways to accommodate students who struggle below grade level or who are ready to do advanced work? I mean, you gave us a powerful anecdote at the beginning of your talk about your classroom in Miami, where you've got a kid 3 years behind and another 3 years ahead of grade level. You found ways you struggled, but you worked to address those problems. Does this not go on in classrooms everywhere? Is in other words, the problem quite as severe as the report implies?
So I'm in classrooms in school districts at least once a week watching this. So I will say, to the extent that they are able to, they will meet students where they are, meet individual students where they are, to the extent that they are able. But their mission is to teach 4th grade math, to teach 7th grade math, to teach 8th grade math. And so when they recognize that their students don't have the skills, they will spiral in as best they can, for as many as they can. But the policy is driving what they are expected to be teaching in that grade level. And so, yes, our teachers are phenomenal. They're my heroes. They are phenomenal practitioners that are doing the best that they can. But the expectation of what they are supposed to teach at a 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade level are very clear, and that is what they will be assessed on. And so if I can comment on Jim's
Sure.
Your use of the word, this is bad news for the department, this is bad news for Congress, this is an indictment. I find that ironic a little bit. I would not view it that way. I don't view it that way. We expect our young people to have a growth mindset. We expect them to embrace failure. And each time that they discover that what they had thought was going to happen didn't quite happen, it's an opportunity is what we call those. This is an opportunity for us to say, we intended it to be this way, but here we are, 15 years later, 3 years later, we have an opportunity to do things differently. And I want to encourage that in the schools in my state to say, to give them the space to have more of those learning aha moments, to say, this is what we thought was going to happen, it didn't drive it, let's create new conditions. And if I expect that of my school districts, I want to set that same culture, that same growth mindset opportunities in the state through policy.
So let me just say, every problem is an opportunity, and I appreciate your optimism about it. I can tell you that the members of Congress when confronted with the need to reauthorize the elementary and secondary, they will not see it as an opportunity. So that's what I meant. It's bad news. It's bad news that we as policy people, based on this evidence, have some serious work to do. And things will be better when we're done. I'm also optimistic about that, but I don't think our complacency that we've got the right system, we got the right law in place, should be tolerated. I think the evidence here is that we need to rethink how we are approaching assessment.
Why wouldn't we? I would personally be more comfortable rather than going to Congress and thinking about reimagining the statutory accountability framework, but think about waivers and think about administrative remedies. Because at least from my vantage point, the fundamental idea that year over year, we expect kids to know certain things. We're going to hold the system accountable for them to learn it, which I think is fundamentally a great idea and is a critical idea. This issue to me is, what do you then do when some group of kids don't, particularly in a subject where it's cumulative, like math? To me, that should be more of an exception. So we can't have the exception swallow the rule. And to me, I mean, some would argue there's some flexibility for some states to do some of this now, and if not, maybe there's ways to adjust things around the edges. But to me, that's more of a waiver sort of approach, not let's reimagine the whole foundation of the statutory framework, which to me would be too dangerous, right? Because the history of this country is we don't expect much of certain types of kids. So I personally wouldn't want to mess with that. I'd rather say this is a unique and specific problem that we need to address precisely. And there's ways I think that can be done through waivers and through state ed commissioners and state leads using some of the discretion they already have to create room for these sort of targeted remedies for a certain period of time, ending maybe by 8th grade to get kids up to grade level. I would personally prefer that because you go back to Congress, it's not going to be pretty.
So
it's not
I think we agree on that, and if you don't mind me making sort of a wonky joke, if Congress is listening, I did not advocate for waivers just now. We've had some history with that in the past. Look, what you're alluding to, though, is something that, so if you don't mind me, Tom, taking this conversation to a sort of a more fundamental potential disagreement. The idea of waivers is basically give states the flexibility to do the right thing. And when confronted with this kind of evidence, we as reformers really can have one of two reactions. One is, well, let's change the mandate so it's not so focused on grade level assessment, because we can see that that's exacerbating the problems. Or we can trust states to figure this out and not issue any mandates. And so what I might encourage is for an across-the-board waiver from Congress to let states figure out assessment in a way that actually focuses on the teaching and learning of students rather than our reform thesis that this is going to be necessary and helpful in the long term.
So, go ahead, Rebecca.
If I could just jump in on the conversation. I mean, I'm feeling a little, I don't feel like we need to have an all or nothing proposition here with respect to the lessons that the report brings, right? I think there's a few things. You know, ESEA is a law enshrined in 1965 that is about ensuring that all students have access to an equitable education, right? So it is appropriately revised by Congress. Sometimes that takes a while, right? But not in 1994, in 2001, again in 2015. I think the lessons that and the evolution of our accountability system, our assessment systems, those are important to bring forward so that Congress can have the deliberate debate around how to shape policies moving forward with respect to ESSA and ESEA. And that conversation in Congress is going to happen. It's going to start to happen soon, because even though for many policymakers it feels like ESSA just passed, Congress is already looking at how we might further revise and reform the law. I also feel like the dichotomy of, well, we're either going to be stuck in the existing requirement as it's crafted with grade level standard, or we're going to provide everyone a waiver and trust that every state is going to act accordingly in terms of the best interests of kids. I'm uncomfortable with that dichotomy. I just feel like we need to be thinking about how do we construct a system that respects the integrity of college and career readiness for all students, and also provides some room for the types of interventions that need to take place and the types of data points, right? And opportunities for teachers and schools to mount instructional improvement that span beyond grade level standards as well as undergrade level standards, right? So the question of how do we respond to schools and how do schools take this up in terms of the grade level standard question is a really important discussion, the question that you set us off on, Tom. Because I think that schools have room and we can further illuminate that with a better policy for schools to give them room to stay focused on college and career readiness for all kids while providing them the space they need to move up and down and to respond to the individual needs of kids. I don't feel like either of those are mutually exclusive of one another.
Sounds like you're supporting Shavar's notion of targeted waivers.
Yeah, I mean, I personally would love evolution of the policy at the large-scale policy at large to focus on, to continue to keep a focus on grade level readiness, but to also embed growth and progress under and over that grade level in an accountability system. I think that would be a policy that all 50 states could embrace and make their own in a way that maintains the integrity of the law's accountability for all kids.
Kirsten?
So I think that's where I lie as well, that we should have some opportunity for states to do that. There are within ESSA and the guidelines from the department some opportunities for the innovative assessment. 7 states. Fundamentally, North Dakota has, honestly taken a look at that. Public education is this huge dynamic ecosystem involving families and publicly elected school boards. And the challenge within the innovation waiver is it's 3 years. You have to provide evidence within 3 years. That's a huge ask of states in order to make sure that you provide that evidence, get all of your teams of teachers, those locally elected board members on board moving in that direction, and show results in 3 years. The challenge then also is you have 7 of them, and it's going to be another 15 years. So you have 7 things going on instead of some micro laboratories out there that could be existing. The other challenges I think we could have some room is within the accountability formula. The fact that North Dakota, one of their portions of their accountability formula is growth, but it's growth within that one grade span. And so again, having to have a significant majority based on academic factors, when you're looking at growth, you're still really, really confining states, allowing our school districts to provide some opportunity to do some things differently. So I think that there are some things that, if the department would work with some states, I think that there are more I know that the department often gets frustrated thinking that we aren't thinking innovatively enough out in the states, and we've taken some pretty public hits on that, but we truly are. So I think there is an opportunity for our federal Department of Education to work with our state departments of education where we can work with our school districts to make these changes. The report mentions Tulsa and Chicago, I believe, that are doing some great things. But how sad is that as a state education agency that we can't allow that we're going to put yet another accountability system on a public local school district? They're going to have to operate under their local school district accountability, their states, and their federal government. That's a lot of onus. I'd rather be a partner with those school districts and have my state accountability provide those opportunities for those school districts.
Right, those would effectively be parallel accountability systems, which is, as you say, onerous. Jim, just describe for us a little bit your broader notion, or your notion of a broader waiver model. How does that sort of compare to some of the thoughts or ideas we've been hearing on the panel?
So because of this report, I went back to look at the law and whether states could do some of the stuff that we've been talking about here today. And so, let's underscore, the innovative assessment systems, they're really cumbersome. They're not so innovative. It's really tough to get that done, right? And so when I saw what our law is sort of trapping people in right now, it's like, well, can't they do it under the law? And the honest answer is, I'm not a lawyer, but I can tell you the lawyers in our department would tell you, if you try and do that, you're out of compliance with the law. And again, since Congress is listening, we always comply with the law, right? So to me, that's where I really think that we need a statutory change to let states do the right thing, to do the kinds of things that Kirsten would do and others across the country without creating a supplemental, additional accountability system, because there is testing fatigue in this country. And I don't know how Chicago does it, where they have their system and then they also have the state system, but I can imagine in lots of parts of this country, people would rebel against that.
So that's helpful, thanks. So just for framing purposes, we're talking about math. The iceberg problem is largely a math problem, or is this a broader issue in our accountability systems that needs to be addressed across subjects?
I would say we are focused on math. So it may be, it may not be. I know that the dependencies in math are probably a bit more precise, and the grain size of the skills and standards are different for math than they are in English language arts. And the specialists in English language arts who I speak with say there's actually tremendous benefit to ensuring kids are exposed to grade level material when it comes to English language arts. So it may be a completely different things. We've tried to narrow this report to just focus on math. But one thing related to that I want to point out in response to something Roberto said, which is the innovative assessment pilot waivers that are embedded in ESSA did, in theory, give room for this flexibility. And the law does allow states to test students on pre- and post-grade skills in addition to grade level, which is sort of what I think Roberto was getting at.
Growth.
The challenge is actually from a very practical perspective. Let's say there's roughly 50 fifth grade skills, and the kid's going to take a test. Maybe there's going to be 30 or 40 items on the test. If it has to measure proficiency on grade level, there's not a lot of room to do any testing on pre- and post-grade skills. That may be less of an issue in English language arts, but sometimes the idea of doing both sort of meets with the practical reality of whether in a world where you're going to take a single test that's truly feasible.
Well, that's a fair point, right? I mean, we're talking about growth, and we run the risk of getting in the weeds here, but there are basically two models for establishing performance on the student and school level. One is towards proficiency, are what you look at the percentage of students who are meeting a standard for that grade level. Growth can be sort of measured in a couple of different ways, but essentially you're looking at how much the student learns over the course of a year, excuse me. And regardless of where that student starts. But as we've heard, the challenge with the regulations and the law as currently written is you're only allowed to measure growth across a grade level's worth of skills. So the argument, which seems compelling, is that we should be able in our calculation of growth to include more than a year's worth of skills. Roberto, what's your reaction to that?
So, I mean, I think that it's reasonable to be looking beyond grade level content and standard in an accountability system to an extent. That's just my perspective. I believe that access to grade level content in some form or fashion is an imperative of accountability for all kids. And I'm weary of returning to a time when the subjective determination of a child's ability based on who they are, their family, the color of their skin, predetermines their access to college and career ready content and the ability to prepare for success. That said, I also feel like we have to reckon with what this report points out, which is that if we're solely focused on grade level content as the end all be all of accountability in our system, teachers are responding to that by limiting the instructional and pedagogical tools they use in classrooms and limiting the data they collect about where their kids are and how they need to improve. So for me, that argues that has to be part of the equation here somewhere. But it's in how you do it and in making sure that we maintain some integrity to to making sure that students are on track to college and career readiness at some point. It's just the individual trajectory and progress of those children we know is going to be different from child to child to some degree, and we need an accountability system that I think provides some deeper picture at growth.
Tom, I want to go back to Joel's very honest answer about math. I'm like, he's right. He doesn't have any evidence. But I think if we look broadly, there's a lot of evidence that English language arts are also cumulative, that we have the same problems. All you have to do is look at the NAEP scores. Roughly a third of our 15-year-olds cannot read a basic grade level test. Something has happened along the way where they haven't accumulated the skills, and I think we will continue to see problems there until we start meeting kids where they are reading as well as in math. So just wanted to get that argument out there before we lost it.
That's helpful, thank you. So Shavar, what's your thought on growth measures that measure student skills beyond the boundaries of a single grade level?
Well, I think it's important. I think it should be absolutely a part of a good accountability framework. Again, though, I think I'm probably a broken record, but I think the foundation has to be, we expect every kid to know what we need them to know every year. I mean, a year is a long time, right? 180, 185 days in school is a long time. And to me, it makes sense for the government, which is spending at the federal, state, and local level many hundreds of billions of dollars on public education, to say we demand results for this investment, period. You all figure it out. And I do think there should be much less micromanagement of means in the public education space, and we should empower great local, state, and local leaders to figure it out. But I think the government is very fair to say over the course of a year, and frankly, that's what parents and families are going to expect, right? So we have to be clear about that. No parent is ever going to accept that my baby is going to be in school for 180, 185 days a year, and they shouldn't know certain things, and that there shouldn't be some evidence of whether they've learned those things. So to me, that has to be the foundation. So what I would personally support is if, and I don't know all the ins and outs of the ESSA waiver provision as it relates to innovation and accountability. Maybe there should be an amendment of that piece, right? But I personally would say that we reaffirm, we expect children to learn certain things over the course of a year. And I don't know how you do that, and maybe somebody has some other instrument, but it seems to me there has to be some objective assessment of that. Otherwise, we go back to what we had. And as a local school board president, as a president of the Newark Public School Board, the pressures on the system day in and day out to do things other than what's in the best interest of children is immense, right? And so if you open, and frankly, one of the biggest levers we had was, that Title I money we're getting? I know that this council person wants such and such principal to be the principal over here because they have a relationship with that principal. And I know the mayor wants this vice principal to be this person because they have another relationship with it. And I know the unions want certain things because they feel this person will do other things for them. It's nice to be able to say, hey, you know what, we do all that, guess what, the kids aren't going to learn. We're not going to get the money. And so I think it's very important to be very, very clear about this, that that the practicalities of what happens in the ground in too many of our districts, the accountability mandate is essential to bring pressure to bear on the system. No question, though, that pressure then may produce some other issues. My view is then you have a targeted, surgical, precise capacity to deal with that issue without throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Karen, you support, as you said at the outset, grade level assessments. How are you sort of processing some of the reactions?
So I support grade level assessments because it's what we've got. In absence of anything else, I'm with Shavar. I want there to be a measure of some kind that tells us what the state of play is. It's kind of ironic that this is all based on NAEP, right? That's a snapshot in time. That's about grade level proficiency, right? But why do we use it? Because we actually trust it. So what I'm struggling with, the libertarian in me, I'll be really controversial here, is, if you're a homeschooling parent, you don't look at your 8-year-old and say, okay, you're in 3rd grade, so we're just going to do 3rd grade. It's not what you do. Why do we have grades? It's a construct we have imposed on 50 million children, right? So what we have to try to do is get out of that mindset and get to proficiency of skill. right? We want it to happen by a certain time for sure, but it may take some people longer, may take some people less time, right? So we have to, I just believe in my bones that we have the ingenuity and the technology to do this now, and the structure we have built is keeping us from doing it, and the politics, right? Like this, I'm gonna now date myself with a current events reference, but I'm a big fan of the movie Dave. If we just took a regular person off the street and asked them to solve this, they would solve it, right? Because they don't have all of the trappings of, the system and who's got what piece that they're protecting and all of that, right? So I just feel like the grade system is now what we're chafing against, right? I mean, Joel said it's working for 30% of kids. The natural progression of how we teach, 30% of kids are getting it. That means more than 60% are not. So we've got a system that we've all organized around that's only working for a third of our kids. So to me, you kind of have to be bolder than just how we're testing. It's got to be incentive structure. It's how is the money flowing? Is there real consequences for the kid that shows up in 6th grade who isn't proficient in math? Where are the consequences for that? We have a system that has no consequences for that exact thing happening. Right. So I'm struggling with the bigger, I'd be willing to go bigger picture here to the fact that I don't understand why we categorize kids in grades anymore. Because I've been in a school where they don't do that, and it seems to actually work pretty great. So, I don't know.
All right, fair enough. Joel, let me ask you a question here. So, you write in the report that you and Michael co-authored that this is not a call to reverse the principles of standards, accountability, rigor, transparency, and equity that undergird ESSA. That's actually, that's a lot of stuff. But how can we include below grade level materials on state tests without lowering standards? I mean, this is the fundamental tension we're all grappling with there.
I mean, I go back to the point Roberto said earlier, which is if we're clear about the ultimate end goal, which is college and career readiness, we then have to understand that kids need there may need to be multiple paths to get there. And so we need to measure kids' growth on a journey towards that being the ultimate objective. And when we say the word growth, at least in my mind, when I take my kid to the doctor, I hear that he grew 2 inches. He was 5 foot, now he's 5'2". There's a beginning point and an ending point. We don't do that. The word growth in terms of accountability is really not growth. Yeah. It's how'd you do on the 6th grade standards? How'd you do on the 7th grade standards? It's changes in relative performance. It's not growth. So I think it's completely reconcilable to sort of be completely fixed on what the ultimate objective is, but have measures of success for individual students to get there along the way.
So how do we sort of make clear each student's path towards proficiency or career and college readiness, if that's the final definition of proficiency, in a way that the many audiences, the many constituents for this information can feel comfortable?
Yeah. Well, at the most basic level, if I were told when my child went into 5th grade, look, your child has 300 mathematical skills and concepts that he needs to be ready for high school, and it may take him 2 years, it may take him 6, but we'll get him there as fast as we can and be with him every step of the way, I'd be thrilled. That's exactly what I'd want. It'd be a lot more.
You'd be thrilled with that? Totally. If somebody said it may take 2, it may take 6, we'll figure it out, you're excited about that?
I mean, I want to watch the pace and see how fast, but having the transparency to see that where he is every day or every week and that he's on a path to get there. Now, if I see that he's gone a month and hasn't learned anything, I'm not happy at all. But knowing that like this is the plan and there's full transparency into that, I'm very happy. But if we give every parent an expectation that every kid will only take this amount of time, regardless of where they're starting from, I think we wouldn't be being honest with them.
How do we manage the logistics of that? I mean, you've got thousands of kids at all different points along a spectrum. You've got
we have the technology,
massive communication challenge.
Well, and every kid who has an IEP has that.
But you're right, Tom. I mean, what we've tried to argue in this paper isn't only about assessment and accountability. It's about the need for innovative learning models, the need for new approaches that can do this, for them to be developed and tested and iterated, and for this to be part of what the future of education should look like. And I think the point we're making, as one of a number of organizations trying to do this, is that we're blocked. We're blocked because of how the current path is cemented into policy. So to Shavar's point, how do we create the space for these types of new approaches to be developed and tested and evolved? It's not just about accountability, so that ultimately they can be ready for prime time with the broader community.
So to Shavar's point, I mean, I understand that need, but I'm the mother of 3 adult sons. 2 of them were twin boys. I mean, that was a test case right in my own home, that they are not going to be doing the same things at the same time. They did not reach the same milestones. None of the 3 did. And so I get that parents' expectation, and that's why multiple stakeholders need to be involved in this conversation, parents and our teachers and our school boards and our policymakers. But I do think it's unrealistic, knowing what we know now, to expect that because you're 10 years old, you will know these things. There are just some students that will learn it earlier, and there are some students that will take a little bit more time. But the system that we have set up is that dipstick every year expecting, and that's what our schools are being held accountable to do, and it doesn't allow them the space to do things differently.
The problem I have there, though, is what I would expect to happen based upon history is going to be the kids of color, and their parents are going to be told it's going to take you 6 years to learn the things, and the white kids are going to take you 2, and it's the low-income kids are going to take you 5 and 6. I think that's very dangerous. I'd want to have a lot of transparency about what is the predicate being used. So what is the system using to say, these babies right here, it's going to take you 6, 7 years. The other ones over here is going to take you 2 or 3. That is extremely dangerous. And to me, the history of public education in this country will suggest that's going to be misused more, it's going to be used the right way. So which is, again, why I keep coming back to targeted, evidence-based waivers that state leaders who, at least in theory, working with their superintendent, should know best where that makes sense and where it would go too far.
And
So Shavar, I am so happy you're articulating this, because I can understand how a lot of people, based on the history in this country, would come to the same conclusion. If you do this, low-income, African-American, Latino children will be left behind, and they'll be on that 6-year track. I think the only antidote for that is to continue shining a spotlight on the progress by subgroup. Because what's happening now, as you know, there are a lot of kids going into the 5th grade with 2nd grade math skills, and they keep getting left further and further behind. And we're talking about the same children. And there's no way to bring them up unless we turn our focus to those children who are basically on a treadmill that will lead to failure unless we adjust the system.
I think the grand challenge here is to be able to think about how do we shape an accountability system that truly does hold the system accountable for the progress of every child. I think, parents deserve the right to know, and too many parents today don't have even basic information about whether their kids are mastering grade level standard or not. So just to begin there, I think that's very important for parents to be able to know that. We need data that shows parents where their students are. But we also, I think, need to learn from the evolutions that we have in the assessment system and in the assessment realm. I think we have the ability to measure the progress of individual kids while we're also looking at their mastery of grade level standard. And I think Joel's point's a fair one, right? There's only so many items, only so much time. But if we were to get to, and this was part of the spirit behind the innovative assessment pilot, I think one of the criticisms that was levied today on that pilot, that it does not enable enough of a focus on growth, beyond a grade level, I think that's an absolutely fair criticism. And, maybe if that had been changed, we'd be a little bit further along. But I'm optimistic that if we were to give state leaders and parents and superintendents and teachers a voice in terms of how to shape an assessment and accountability system that actually is more holistic and inclusive of individual progress, and provides that parent clear information about, does my child in 4th grade know 4th grade material or not? Because parents deserve to know that. I think we could move ahead on this. I mean, I think but it does require us to push the boundaries of what this debate has been for at least for the past 17 years.
Joel, are you proposing that policymakers do away with annual testing?
No.
Because if we do that, then you can't gauge growth.
No.
Right?
I think annual testing is critically important. I think we're proposing if there's annual testing and those tests are only grade level items, then that provides instructional incentives to teach kids grade level items. And for some kids, that might be the perfect thing, but for many, that's actually not the right thing that they should learn. But you should absolutely measure growth, and you can also use those growth-related assessments to correlate them back to national norms. So parents still have visibility into where their kid is relative to grade level proficiency and relative to where other students are performing. So there's ways of doing both using norms and using other approaches to provide that transparency to parents.
That's helpful. So in response to some of the suggestions that we innovate, there seems to be pretty broad consensus on the panel that we do that. You recommend the creation of what you call math innovation zones. How would they work? How would they address some of the ideas that have been shared by the panel?
And just because we didn't invent this. This was something the state of Texas invented that we are just trying to make people aware of. So what the state of Texas did is the first thing is they tried to identify the schools and districts that wanted to be the innovators. So they made it entirely voluntary. The second is they identified a set of partners for them to work with to design and implement new innovative learning models and approaches in math. And then they gave them an adaptive assessment to measure growth. And that sort of was the sandbox that they created to support innovation. I suspect what they'll do over time, at the end of 3 years, they'll look and they'll see which schools and which providers got the strongest growth, and maybe they'll expand those that those work with, and which ones didn't get as much growth, and those will be the ones that sort of fall by the wayside. But you can imagine this world evolving over time where it's almost kind of like we call it bifurcated delivery model. So in air travel, we all get safely to our destination because we have the plane makers that make the planes, and we have the airlines that run them. And the combination of both of those makes sure that all planes get there safely. One can imagine a world where there are model providers, those that are designing totally different ways of doing school, school managers that actually run the day-to-day in a school, and the combination of both equally accountable for outcomes, and the combination of both that actually get us a far greater level of reliability than sort of the current system where the schools and school districts have to do it all.
Right. Again, that's helpful. Let's go back to the teacher for a second before we bring the audience in with questions so you can be thinking about them. If we expand the course of study, if you will, the curriculum in a grade level, or in a classroom across several grade levels, right? In other words, if the teacher is working not just on 7th grade math skills, but on 5th through 9th grade skills, how does the teacher survive that? How does that sort of crucible? How do we help teachers reconcile the need to not only teach a discrete set of skills, but a wide range of them with kids who are at very different places?
I mean, that's what the innovation's all about. I mean, we've got some of Kirsten's schools that are trying to figure that exact thing out. That's what our work is about. That's what others are about. How do we design these experiences to do that? So can't necessarily pull it, off the shelf for 10 million kids because we're still in the early stages of designing it, but that's why we need this kind of innovation.
I mean, I think, Tom, you are describing a dynamic that many teachers wrestle with every day in the classroom, right? How do they differentiate their instruction so that it is responsive to, closing and remediating those content gaps for kids that they know, regardless of whether the state tells them or not, that those kids are significantly behind some grade level? And how do they think about how to do that and also challenge others to go even further? So I don't want to understate I think it is the paramount challenge of how might we differentiate pedagogy and instructions and instructional interventions to meet the needs of individual kids. That is our grand challenge for educational change moving forward, right? Because if we're going to be successful at what we set out to do around college and career readiness for all kids, I think it demands that.
Yeah.
But I think that the report punctuates it. I think it punctuates the need for us to better focus on helping teachers get there. And I think and then there's this question around what's fair in terms of progress. Like, what should teachers get credit for and recognized for doing? And I think if teachers are moving students dramatically, even beyond one grade level worth of learning over the course of a year, I'd want to celebrate that progress. I think that's fair.
How would you celebrate it? With more compensation?
Tying
compensation to performance?
I would celebrate it with, first by naming it, which we don't do in our system right now. We don't name teachers that go further with their kids. And I'd create the right mechanisms for more teachers to be able to learn from that. I think it is less about, I think teachers all deserve greater compensation. And I support differentiated roles and responsibilities and compensation in schools. But I think this is about naming it.
Right. Fair enough.
And rewarding it within the accountability system. So I think teachers don't need a lot. They just need to be given sometimes credit for the onus work that they are doing, the heroic work that they're doing in their classrooms. And we simply aren't doing that in the accountability system. And so I think it does require an incredible amount of teacher time together, allowing them the time to do this together, to really scaffold and build those skills, to identify them. They need professional development within their teacher preparation programs to begin that now, of helping them identify learning gaps and identify interventions that are successful, research-based interventions. Those current teachers that are part of our cohorts now, they are spending that time really identifying what those grade level competencies and proficiencies are, and we need to figure out a way to give them credit for moving that child however far they got them. I believe that it is important to recognize, are they at fourth grade? We're making progress there, but to give them credit is going to be, they'd love more money, obviously, but simply right now we need to give them the professional kudos that they deserve when they're doing this and for the extra work that they're doing. As we talk about moving into this different mindset, it is critically important. One of the things that our accountability system now is really restrictive on as well is we're talking about those students that they're moving that need remediation, but we have yet to talk about those students that are trapped in fourth grade and could be at sixth grade, at seventh grade. Our accountability system does not recognize the heroic work that our teachers are doing with differentiation to move them as well. So much of the work that needs to be recognized is failing to be recognized in the accountability system that we have.
And it does, your remarks do suggest that this is a school level problem at least, and less of an individual classroom level, right? I mean, it feels like teams of teachers working together to calibrate correctly the instruction for individual students is going to be more successful than expecting an individual teacher to do that for 25 kids.
But what we're having is schools are providing great opportunities for grade level teachers to come together and work. They're assuming that their reading skills, their math skills are all intact when they get to fifth grade. They are not. What needs to happen, and what's happening with our schools within North Dakota in this innovative work, is it's cross grade level. They're talking about, this is what this student is missing, and he is leaving my fourth grade classroom, he's coming to your fifth grade classroom, so here's where she is, here's where he is, and those teachers are now planning into their day, okay, with this group I'm going to work on these fundamental skills, and I'm not going to move on to fifth grade level until we have made sure that those gaps don't exist for these 5 students or these 6 students. But our accountability system is still saying, okay, you have 25 in your classroom, all 25 have to be at this fifth grade, regardless if they didn't even get to start teaching fifth grade skills until November or December with those 5. So.
Thank you. Questions? Yes, right in the middle. It's coming. Tell us who you're with.
Hi, Laura Jimenez, and I'm with the Center for American Progress, also formerly on the waiver team, so I know a little bit about the law. And I would actually say that a lot of this discussion is predicated on the presumption that ESSA doesn't already allow for measuring growth beyond grade level, and that's in fact not true. if you actually read the indicators for public schools that are elementary or middle schools, the growth measure does not have to be based on the statewide assessments. So the law already allows what you all are talking about. Two, one thing I'd really be interested in seeing is in an ESSA reauth, getting an accountability pilot, right? Because I think states don't have the political cover or the policy to be able to really innovate in accountability. So allowing for that authority would, I think, give the states the room that they need. Another, based on Shavar's previous point, let's fund an evaluation, a pilot, maybe through national activities of a program, but let's fund something, a couple of schools in a district to be able to do some of this work. Let's get some lessons learned and create policy on top of that. Because I think the problem that Shavar is pointing to is that when you create policy, you're doing it for the bad actor, right? For the folks that may not necessarily have all of students' best interest in mind, and you have to protect for that. So giving a blanket waiver, as you will, to all states is probably going to give you some unintended consequences that are worse than what we're seeing now.
Great, thank you very much.
Couple more points.
Let me just get some Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Get some reactions to the initial notion that we can already be doing those.
Well,
Joel.
I think there's 2 points. The first is that is true, but my understanding of the law is those assessments need to be statewide assessments.
Yeah.
So you would need the state to both adopt their regular state assessment for everyone in the state and then also have a growth assessment for everyone in the state. That's the first. The second is some of the adaptive assessments that are used to measure growth also under federal law have to get past what's called peer review. This gets really wonky, but some of the regulations that are in the peer review part actually require alignment to grade level standards. So what it may appear to be possible in one part of the law actually takes it away in another.
Jim, what's your take on that?
I wish it were true. But as I look at the law, I don't see it being implemented that way. And I think that there are constraints. Well, let's let the state superintendent address this issue, right?
Well, actually, Joel summed it up very, very well. When you actually engage in that process, there are requirements that it needs to be standardized across the state, and it has to be there. There is another area as you dig in. It's like no, it needs to be within grade levels to ensure that it's consistent and delivered to every student in that same replicable way. And so, and it would be above and beyond. There is an opportunity, I think, that we are exploring right now that it would be our 5th indicator, is what it's generally called. It's the non-academic. Currently, we're using student engagement, really using not attendance work, but using student engagement. We might split that and a part of our percentage and do our formative tests, because our state law does require at least 2 formative tests, spring and fall and spring, and we may use some of that. But again, it's the non-academic factor that would be allowable if we would choose to pursue that.
And what about the notion of an accountability pilot?
I mean, to the extent that it was allowable under the federal law, it'd be great to do something like that. I don't know that given the current boundaries of pulling that off and how the innovative assessment pilots work, it provides the right kind of flexibility.
And my understanding is Tulsa and Chicago, that's exactly what they've done.
Yeah, they just say, take the state of test, but what we're really focused on are the adaptive tests that measure growth.
And generally, even though Tulsa and Oklahoma, or Tulsa and Chicago, they've done that, that's generally the belief and the feeling, the sentiment of the school districts in my state. And that makes me very sad as a state leader, because I don't want to be something that they go around. I want to be, okay, we've identified the problem. What is it that we can create as a state that will help you get to the end of improvement for all students?
I mean, is the Texas Innovation Zone, is that part of what?
Sure, it's a great example, yeah.
But if that can work right now under the law, then why can't others do that? Or what's the issue there?
The students in the Math Innovation Zone are still taking the state test. It's just that the state is saying, what we're really going to look at are these growth assessments.
And that's
What's wrong with that?
that
Like,
is
if
my
everyone-
dream.
Chicago
Parents
does, that's what
freak
Tulsa
out.
does.
Yeah.
I think Kirsten's
We're
point is
testing.
that's kind of the workaround.
Okay.
But is it
good enough?
to
Wonder if
Shavar's
I
point,
push
is that
everybody
a
to do that. It's
reasonable
good enough.
workaround? I mean, without having to take
I mean,
regulatory
if it's good enough,
or
why
legislative
can't
action
everybody
on
do
it?
that?
Well, this is why it's the first recommendation in our paper.
The law doesn't allow that. The law doesn't allow that right now.
Well, the law allows local accountability systems.
Yes,
So
but there's a single statewide assessment system, and then there is the innovation pilot, and even the innovation pilot, I think, as you pointed out, Joel, you have to be within the statewide system while you're also developing this pilot. So, I think there does need to be some. I think it's a combination of will and leadership at the federal level and at the state level, and potentially some modifications to, as we look forward to the reauthorization, about what might need to change to encourage more innovation in accountability and in assessment at large.
And that's where we're at with pilots. I think pilots is a great idea, and I think that's where we need to go. So to Karen's earlier point about, and to Shabar's expectation of return on investment for billions of dollars, I get that every time I stand in front of the podium of my appropriations committee in my state. We have been conditioned as a nation for generations to look at NAEP scores, ACT, SAT, and our state assessment scores. I get that I'm going to need to keep showing my legislators that evidence, but while I'm doing that, I want to get to a new point of saying, while you're looking at this, could you also look at this? And eventually recondition and reframe the conversation. And that's why it's going to take assessment developers, it's going to take stakeholders of families and educators and policymakers to come together to develop the answers to this. And the providers are an essential part of this, of helping us incubate these ideas.
So in the interim, Texas has two systems. Is that what you're suggesting? It's the grade level based assessment system, and then it's innovation work that sits next to it.
I would say Texas has one system for all schools. Then they have this math innovation zone for a very small number of districts and schools that want to do something in addition to that. And the way they measure success of that program are on the growth-related assessments.
Okay.
And essentially, if I'm reading that correctly, they're getting some reprieve from their state education agency, from their legislative body, that's saying, we're not going to yank and spank you or rank and spank you while you're doing this time. Trying to be innovative, we're going to look at this. And so that's truly the route forward.
Yes, in the back. You. Yep.
Hi, I'm Medora Jones with the Learning Policy Institute. And schools with a significant number of students performing below grade level are likely to be underfunded or have teachers who are more inexperienced and lack teacher preparation. So I was wondering how the iceberg problem relates to resource equity issues.
Good question.
I mean, this paper is trying to create the conditions for all kids to succeed. We tried to make clear that it's not just all about assessment and accountability. We talked about leadership, climate, teachers. Funding matters a lot too. So while we didn't touch on it on this particular paper, I couldn't agree more with the premise that just shifting the policies and accountability landscape cannot, in and of itself, address some of the issues that you bring up.
Okay. Others?
So my name's Jasmine. I'm from the American Federation of Teachers, and I really liked the way that the panel ended the conversation around educators being a part and a voice in this solution. I definitely agree with that, and I thought that the paper and the recommendations kind of still kept educators at arm's length. Yes, there needs to be time for collaboration, but I really think that with this type of policy issue, that having the voice of educators at the table, speaking with policymakers, making sense of the data and how those policies get implemented in the classroom, and the structural changes that impact them in the classroom, really is beneficial at that voice. And I wanted to just put a pin in that because I heard it slowly bubbling up throughout this panel, which was very great. But the educator voice in this, and them realize, like, they do this day in and day out. When it comes to understanding students' progress towards grade level standards, they know that. It's just not in the accountability system in a certain way that, everyone is, happy-go-lucky about. However, they are the ones doing the work at that classroom level, and they can help those conversations bubble up. And I plug to Teach Plus, but I thought that would have come up a little bit more with the work that you guys do with your ambassadors and fellows. So just wanted to put a pin in that.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just to comment on that briefly. I mean, I think, there are two imperatives here and lessons from this report. And one is, how might we think about large-scale policy change? And and a stronger federal-state partnership in terms of how states are structuring those accountability systems so that they have the integrity they need to hold our system accountable for the progress of all kids. We don't lose kids in that system. But I think the other imperative here is how do we do a better job of providing information, data, and creating the norms in our teaching profession that we need for our teachers to truly be able to collaborate, respond in real time to the needs of their kids, work as a team to get ahead, deepen their skills and knowledge from as content teams, right? If we're looking at mathematics, and we have a project underway right now at Teach Plus that is pairing 5 schools in Chicago with 5 schools in Los Angeles, looking at 8th grade mathematics proficiency. And it's about principals and department chairs and teacher leaders all working together around that challenge. So if we can provide our schools and our teachers the support and the resources and the tools they need to do that, and also provide the integrity in our accountability system to recognize that progress, I think that's the way forward.
It's an interesting point because, as we know, right, at the middle school level, you're likely to find the highest concentrations of math teachers who are not trained as mathematicians.
Right.
Their certification allows them to teach the subject, but they're not really math specialists, and that only exacerbates the problem. Yeah. And others?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, good morning. My name's Emily Hill. I'm a Los Angeles Unified School District teacher who's actually on leave for the year as an Albert Einstein Distinguished Educator Fellow working in a congressional office. I'm used to being able to be highly reactive within my own classroom in order to attend to student needs. And what I'm finding here is that as we are looking at law issues, ESEA is only reauthorized every 10, 15 years. It seems to be extremely reactive. And in rewriting the laws, you have to look ahead to what are the next problems going to be over the next 10 to 15 years and trying to keep that in mind as policies are being developed. What are your recommendations for how do we get ahead of this problem? Instead of every time looking backwards, trying to fix what didn't quite get written correctly in these laws, how do we move ahead to a point where we are actually preventing all of these unforeseen outcomes?
That's an easy one.
I personally think the way to do that is I think the Congress isn't really built to do the things you're talking about, in my judgment, nor is really the federal government in this space. So my view would be that I think the government should be almost like a huge foundation when it comes to public education, which is fund, recommend best practices that are proven to work that can be scaled, and then be clear about the outcomes that are expected with that investment. You know, it gets into some of these issues, but I think there has to be some core expectations. Then the state and local leaders should have broad flexibility to, in real time, figure out what their states and communities need, consistent with certain best practices that just work across the board and consistent with leveraging technology that can work across the board. But that at the state and local level, you have some flexibility around means, but the federal government is demanding outcomes. Because a 10, 15-year, first of all, anything, frankly, at the federal legislative level is just not built to deal with the sort of dynamism you're talking about, let alone ESSA, given the time frame, which tends to be around a decade. That has to happen more at the state and local level, and it's hard enough even to do there, because one thing we haven't talked much about is the churn of politics in our public school system, right? So I mean, you know, very few principals, particularly in our urban and even in, you know, I can't speak as much for the rural districts, but many of the urban districts, they don't last more than 2 and 2.5 years. Superintendents don't last more than 3 years. In many of these communities, you have a new mayor coming in every, you know, handful of years. Then you may have a new governor who has a different vision. This happens all the time. And so there needs to be a whole different vision about how do we reorganize all of that to deal with the dynamism you're talking about. But to me, the best way is for the government to pay, demand performance, have certain, you know, equity guarantees, you know, all kids have to be served a certain type of way, but then give flexibility and means to local school systems.
Jim, do you agree?
Yeah, so I'm going to have to weigh in here, aren't I? So to my fellow Angelino, thank you very much. And your being here as a fellow indicates you're one of the top STEM teachers in the country. Appreciate your views here. You're asking a really fundamentally good question about the role of the federal government. The way you could tell the history of the federal government role is that it responded to egregious failures at the local and state level. It's why one of their key purposes is to enforce the civil rights laws in this country. It's why ESSA comes alongside states to help them educate disadvantaged children, because states and local districts were doing a horrible job at it, right? And same with students with disabilities. That act was passed in '74 because as you looked around the country, it was close to criminal what was happening with students with disabilities. So that's why the federal government got involved. What I think this report and other evidence suggests is that it may be time to take a step back and see if the role of the federal government is still productive. Because we're not nimble. It takes 10 years to change policy, and then it's a look back. And I just think we could have a much more responsive education system if we continue to push power away from the federal government down to states and local governments. Probably more than you wanted to hear, but you're asking the larger question. And I think fundamentally, we all have to think about whether there's still an appropriate role for the federal government and what it should look like.
Any reaction to that?
Well, I think with boundaries, I think is the key, right? So I mean, I think that, because I don't want anybody to be confused, but I think, I think the means absolutely should be state and local, but with boundaries. And absolutely the civil rights guarantees are critical, right? And that's where I started, right? Title I came in the aftermath of the civil rights movement because states and locals, frankly, were intentionally not educating students of color, students with disabilities, even to some degree, but lesser so poor white students and students who speak English as a second language. It wasn't even a pretext, right? So we have to be very clear about that. So we can't. So to me, the firm federal mandate is to say that we expect all kids to be at a certain level, and we will take the money away from you if you don't, and these states need that money, I think has to be non-negotiable from where I stand. However, how do you teach fifth grade math, and how do you deal with first, we want everybody to be on grade level at fifth grade math, but if you're not, how do you do that? And what curriculum do you use? I think a lot of that flexibility should be at the state and local level. But equity and accountability around results, I think the feds and state government should demand that.
I have to get Karen in this. We'll have time for like 2 more questions, so we'll be thinking of them, and then Chris is going to wrap up. But go ahead.
So two points. First of all, someone has to fund risk.
Yes.
We don't fund risk in this system. The government can't fund risk.
Why not?
Because the public won't let them.
But they do in energy, they do in defense,
but in
they do in healthcare.
But in this topic, we have the people who elect our officials who are of a certain age and expect a classroom to look like the classroom they went through, right? So we've got that whole dynamic. But we have these environmental conditions that prevent this flexibility that you guys are talking about, which would be lovely, from happening. So for example, we in this country today, currently in most states, cannot pay more for a teacher who is teaching a subject that is hard to staff. That is impossible to do in nearly every state in this country. We don't have a market. We can't say, we can't get a physics teacher in a town of 5,000 people in the middle of Iowa unless we pay them more. Guess what? We're not going to have a physics teacher. So there's the risk issue of how do you innovate, protecting all of the things that need to be protected, especially with a public dollar. And then we have all these other conditions that prevent us from doing the things that would be logical to do in the system to serve kids because of the way it's set up.
But on this question, we have an administration that is committed to innovation. Jim, talk about the Ed department. Jim is the policy director and is committed to innovating in the ways that you're talking about. We're hearing from the president of Democrats for Education Reform, a very similar vision to one that supports a wide range of experimentation on this issue, right? It sounds like we've got bipartisan support for the kinds of innovation that you're suggesting we need.
We need to elect them to Congress. These two guys.
No thanks.
All right, fair enough. Okay,
Congress wrote the law. He
So-
doesn't have an ability to go outside of the law.
And Karen touched on something I think that is worthy of exploring further in this conversation. The tradition of the way that we do school is deeply rooted in American history, deeply rooted. And it really is the only true collective final last experience that we all experience together. And so you can't just say our mindset needs to be different, like we shouldn't be thinking about it that way. There are people that aren't going to let you take a risk with their child.
Right.
It worked, and especially those with the most voice and the most capacity, it worked okay for them. And so we need to show them ways. We can't just say you must think differently. We must show them that it can be possible and their child will be better off for it. But that is really, really challenging for elected officials to be able to, I mean, their life cycle is 4 years at a time. And so to have the long game in mind with a child, a parent, when suddenly school looks drastically different for their second grader than it did for them, that's change and that's trust.
But I wonder, and again, a couple more questions, but I just got to stay on there for a second. So I wonder if you and Jim and Shavar went up to the Hill and got together with Lamar Alexander and Bobby Scott and said, look, we've got an innovation pilot here, but it's not quite as sort of elastic as it might be. We want to push the boundaries here a little bit. We want to try something new to address this clear problem, whether it couldn't be sort of worked out within the current the confines of the current law. I don't know, right?
Well, I do know the first question they'd ask is, where does the teacher union stand on it?
They've been quite supportive.
I hope so.
Yeah, the AFT and the NAA both contributed to this report, and they've been remarkably supportive in the messages there.
I would just say the example where it was the teachers union, the chamber, the state chamber, and the SCA, the state education agency, those are 3 people that spent 6 weeks of their time traveling around. We were all arms locked, let's do this.
I mean,
people should
interestingly,
remember,
right?
Bobby Scott, though, pushed against, remember, the teachers union wanted to relax accountability under ESSA more than many civil rights groups did, and they work with Bobby Scott, among others, to push back against that. So I think somebody like him, again, if it was targeted, if there were evidence, if there had to be an evidence-based intervention, and that there was some boundary, whether it's 8th grade, maybe before, where the kids have to get to grade level, but somebody like him, who comes out of Virginia context, remember, after Brown in Prince William County, Virginia, folks decided to close the whole school system rather than integrate. So for somebody like him, it better be very narrow, it better be very, scientifically calibrated, or he's not going to try to hear it.
Yeah,
and I wouldn't blame him, to be frank.
No, fair enough. But on the teacher union side of this, right, you would be helping address a challenge that teachers struggle with in their classrooms every day. That is how to address the wide-ranging needs of 25 students, right? And you would also create an opportunity to provide sort of more credit for the growth that they make with students who even though they happen to be below grade level, right? You make up 2 years out of a 3-year deficit. You're doing a good job as a teacher. Teachers don't get credit for that now, right? Yeah. Right. Yeah. One more. Yes. Okay. This is your last chance. All right. Chris Rush, New Classroom's co-founder, is going to come up and share a couple of reflections, and then we'll have a chance to thank our panel.
Thanks, Tom.
Sure.
And thank you. Thank you all so much for coming here today. Joel and I are extremely grateful that you took the time to come here, to tune in, and to not only learn about the iceberg problem itself, but to learn that there are actually tangible, actionable things that can be done to make it better. And before I continue with my closing thoughts, I just want to extend a special thanks to our moderator, Tom Talk from FutureED, and to our amazing set of panelists, Shavar, Karen, Jim, Roberto, and Kirsten, for taking the time and having such a lively and passionate conversation with all of us today. Please join me. Today, I think we heard a lot about why this issue is not only so critically important, but also why it's a bit tricky. I mean, take a look at some of the things that we were discussing today. There's a debate about whether or not there's even room to be able to do this innovation at all. Some say yes, some say no. Some say let's make exceptions. Some say we need to do pilots. Others say that only 11% of my students are proficient. We need to do something now. It is tricky to figure out what ends up happening. There's other parts of the conversation where we're a little more hesitant about whether or not we should take action because there's a concern about whether or not we should roll things back and the dangers, especially in the terms of the social justice and the issues of civil rights that come from some of the existing accountability practices that are, in fact, in place. And then there's a whole other debate that was happening up here that was about whether or not this problem, is really bad news for Congress and education reformers, or whether or not it's great news because it's an opportunity to do something differently. In reality, intelligent people can disagree. But I think you would all agree with me that this is an important set of conversations for us to be having. And if there is something that we all agree on, if there's at least one thing that we come to consensus on, it's that right now, today, school isn't working for far too many kids. And we absolutely need to find a better way to do it, period. But for now, we hope that you leave here today not only with an understanding of the iceberg problem itself and some of the things that can be done about it, but also with a glimpse of the great potential of what school could be if we all collectively take a look with a fresh set of eyes and unhinge ourselves from the assumptions about how school worked when we were in school and how school has to work today. Basically, with all the kids who are all the same age, learning the same thing at the same time, regardless of what it is that they're excelling at and what it is that they are struggling with. When we do that, we start to see that there must be better ways to do this. And the good news is, with those fresh eyes, we are beginning to see the creation of new learning models, not that abandon accountability, but that extend the potential and the power of it. Ones that enable a far more tailored approach to providing instructional activities in order to better serve the unique strengths and needs of each and every student. We hope you can join us in seeing this future, one that delivers far stronger outcomes for far greater numbers of students. Not just those students who are falling behind and need to catch up in order to get a passing grade, but each and every student who has a wealth of untapped potential and could achieve so much more. That's the future we see, that's the future we believe in, and that's the future we're fighting for. If you'd like to learn more, and we sincerely hope that you do, we encourage you to go to icebergproblem.org, where you can download the full report, an executive summary, and even a nice, colorful, one-page visual description of the problem itself. Thank you all so much for coming here today. Joel, myself, the panelists will be sticking around if you want to continue the conversation. Thanks again so much. Have a great afternoon.
That was great. So good. And I really apologize.